who is a lecturer in the Kent Law School, University of Kent. Claire has a really quite unusual career pattern, I think I can say, in that he trained as a barrister in I think qualified in 2005, and worked in tax law for quite a few years, and made, I guess, a fairly substantial career change, and completed a PhD in 2020 in international tax law and political economy, more or less, which, as I say, is quite an unusual combination. I suspect we have not here as the only speaker who has published in both, I mean, get it right, the Journal of Tax Administration and the Review of Radical Political Economy. Probably not just here, but maybe you might be unique. Anyhow, so has a very interesting set of intellectual backgrounds, and this, which I think is, we may find out how it connects to those, or is just something that you've been thinking about in parallel, but he's going to talk to us today about dissipative structures in, I guess, in life and in the international corporate world. Is that?
Well, there won't be much. Well, I don't think there'll be much corporate stuff.
Oh, okay.
Or tax. We'll see.
Oh, well.
Okay. Maybe I'll cover the question now. If people really want to know what the connection is with tax, then we might hang on to that. But I don't plan to.
Okay, no, I think you're abstract. Anyway,
yeah.
Dissipative structures, definitely different dissipative structures gone rogue, as you see, and well, thank you for
Thanks so much. So a little bit of health warning, which is that I have a cold. So don't. So I'm going to. So I think if you all concentrate on the fact, and I won't give anyone leaves. It's not a very pleasant cold, and that has the consequence. Has a number of consequences. One of which is that I've obviously it's going to impair my brain function, which would mean it's quite possible I don't actually understand the things that I'm saying. So apologies in advance for that. Thank you so much for the invite. It's incredibly exciting to be here to talk about this stuff. It's quite a sort of I have an ulterior motive, which is that I would love to produce a philosophy of biology research output, and what that would involve would be that it would involve doing some kind of research masters. So if anyone thinks that they'd like to supervise that piece of research, then this is your opportunity to find out what that piece of research is about, because it would be connected to some of this stuff. So as John mentioned, I'm a lawyer. There won't be any law here, but the presentation is going to be divided up by disciplines. Let's get that mouse. Here we go. So I'm going to start off with some classical political economy, and then the argument's going to move on to some statistical mechanics. And then the next discipline we're going to get involved in is biology. Well, I call it xenobiology because it's the biology of an alien thing, not an alien thing from a different planet, but an alien thing from a different planet, which makes it harder. So I think we need to theorize it's alien. It's biology. And the fourth discipline is lurid speculation. I'm hoping that I run out of time before I get to that bit, because then I might at least retain a certain amount of pure respect as a scholar. Now, this first three sections, there's a work in progress. There's a paper that's currently under review about political economics. I'm me and my co-author, and he was going to be here, but something came up last minute. It would have been good if he was here, because he's the one who really understands the political mechanics. I'm getting that from him. Anyway, and then he's not responsible for lurid speculation. All right, that's the political economy section. Look, here's a conductive process. There's a sort of bread commodity chains, starts with some grain, gets turned into flour, flour gets into dough in the oven, then gets sold over here in the British shop. But this is meant to be a kind of sort of synecdoche for the whole of the production of commodities by means of commodities. So we've got some extractives down there, or chopping down trees, and they've got their making machines and things over here, transport, got retail over here. Obviously, everyone who's involved in these processes, they need to eat and clothe themselves or whatever. So that's where they get all their stuff. But if we did all with the arrows from all the means of subsistence and means of production, we can just get so complicated. What we can do is we can put a boundary around it and just talk about means of production, means of subsistence are being produced within this boundary and then get cycled back into production. And then what comes out of it is a surplus, physical surplus of stuff. More gets produced than is used up. Right? We know more gets produced than is used up because there are sectors that lie outside of it. We've got the finance sector here, obviously. Here you've got some healthcare, state, private. We've got what's known as the sphere of social reproduction here, and also you've got capitalists, and lots of the physical surplus goes to their luxury consumption, and they own production, and labour is sold to them, and the profits that arise in connection with this physical surplus accrue up there. So we can tidy it up by getting rid of the Richard Scarry stuff. If anyone representing the state of Richard Scarry is watching, okay, we tidied up by getting rid of Richard Scarry stuff. All being producing is used up on a capital association. This doesn't need to be big, make it smaller. What arises in relation to this is what I think of as the value theory question in classical political economy, which is by what measure of equivalence between heterogeneous commodities and this system being modeled as a totality. And you can't use money, so you're not using money, you can't use money because everything, the assumption is that everything's exchanging for its value. So if everything's exchanging for its value, then it's not really clear where the surplus is coming from, because if you buy the labour and the commodities, commodity, then where's the extra value coming from? It doesn't really, you can't work, you can't model the kind of objective of this existence of surplus using money. That doesn't work. So the classical political economists, I mean, obviously that's what people do now. That's what bourgeois economics does. But we're thinking here about an objective surplus, which can't be modeled by money. And so you look at this and think, what's the thing that's being introduced here that gives rise to the surplus? And the intuitive answer is labour. And of course, that's the labour theory of value that Marx probably represents the sort of zenith of thinking about. And Marx said, well, look, obviously the surplus comes from the labour that goes in, and but it's also the basis of equivalence between commodities. You get this quite scary feedback loop, whereby capitalists are buying the labour and the means of production in order to make more of these sort of equivalence tokens. You end up with this situation that he described like this: as capital has one single vital impulse, the tendency to create value and surplus value. Capital, he said, is dead labour that vampire-like only lives by sucking living labour, and lives the more labour it sucks. And this is a very frightening vision of what capital does. So if you find if you take this premise that the surplus comes from labour, then you end up in this very dark place. And the Marxist analysis famously predicts that capitalism lurches from crisis to crisis, creating inequality, violence, and environmental degradation. And so its empirical its predictions are very much borne out by what happens in practice. but there's some important notices like imposting. We'll go back to that. But the thing is, it doesn't actually. This is the crucial point we were discussing earlier. It doesn't actually. Well, you can't do it. You can't model this process using labour, not because the bourgeois economists are writing that Marx is wrong twice. Got to be wrong because otherwise we have to get rid of capitalism. It's not that. It's because if you try and model it, there are more equations than there are. Sorry, there are more variables than there are equations. Which, if you know anything about maths, which I don't, it's why I wish Ben was here, you'll know that means it's literally impossible to do the maths. You can't solve it if there's more variables than there are equations. I'm seeing nods, that's good. And that problem, known as the transformation problem, can't be solved unless you drop one of the variables. And the variable that you drop if you want to solve it is this one, value. You drop the idea of labour as a measure of equivalence between heterogeneous quantities. This was realised by a guy called Clair Quentin in the 1960s. He said, no, what you do is you model physical surplus on a sector by sector basis. You get rid of value completely as a basis for looking at the system as a totality, and you just do some complex maths that I would definitely just talk you through called linear algebra, which is to do with modeling a system by working. So you've got iron corn here, because typically you do it with iron corn. You say we make more iron than we use up in the production of, we make more iron than we use up in the production of iron. We make more corn than we use up in the production of corn. And you can do the maths with that. That worrying about value. Right, what's the glass of milk? Okay, the glass of milk is really important. The reason it's a glass of milk is because I was explaining this to a colleague of mine at Kent, who's an analytical philosopher called Steve Pethick. Do you know Steve? Steve Pethick. He knows you. Everyone knows you. I was explaining this. I was presenting a paper which is kind of related to this, but it's not this paper. It's got much more legal content, and we were talking about the kind of unknowability of surplus. The reason that surplus is unknowable is because this is the important thing about this is because it's a process, right? Because this totality of output that's a surplus over and above the input doesn't exist at the same time as input. So you have to presuppose simultaneity in order to make the maths up. Stephen Knight said, well, you can understand surplus. Look, he used the example of a glass of milk. He said, if you pour too much milk into a glass, you can see the surplus will spill, and that's where that's knowable. You can point to it. But the point, and I said, the expression of shock and horror on his face was really terrible. I said, well, it's not like that. Production of surplus commodities by means of commodities is more like a glass of milk pouring itself into itself and a constant flow of surplus milk coming out. And he said, well, that just can't be right. If you can tell that that's wrong, that's obviously just wrong. And I was like, well, that's capitalism. It's a process that's just, it's wrong. But that is what happens. And somebody else said, well, yeah, but you're using up raw materials. So people in the conversation didn't like where it was going, wanted to kind of explain the fact that this is a glass of milk pouring itself into itself and constant milk coming out, right? And you might think, and if you know a bit about physics, you might know a bit about the second law of thermodynamics, you might be thinking to yourself, well, there is a thing where there's a constant production of it, and that's entropy. You might be thinking that. Did anyone think that? Well, and sure enough, people have been thinking that. There are economists who say, well, all of this stuff to do with value and That's it all springs ultimately from the second law of thermodynamics. I mean, if you're talking about entropy in the context. So there's three things to be thinking about. There we go. So that's F entropy. So three ways of thinking about surplus here. We've got value. Remember the value in the Marxist sense is quantities of average labour under prevailing conditions of production. Yeah, that's what value is in the Marxian system. Quantities of average labour under prevailing conditions of production. That's one way of thinking about surplus. Another way is, okay, there's one point about this, it captures the core dynamic of capitalist mode of production as a social process, right? Remember the thing we said about how its predictions about the way this process unfolds and what its effects are seem to be good, right? So it captures that dead labour feeding off the living and that kind of horror. That's one way of looking at this. Another way we talked about is
We'll go to sleep for a second and then we'll come back.
Thank you. Another way to talk about sector by sector physical output, this is the strapping approach. And the good thing about that is that the maths checks out. Yeah? And then the third way to talk about it is energy transformed or entropy arising. And the good thing about that is it's science. Right? And we like that, because that means we can talk to scientists and we can all have the same conversation because they don't trust us if we just talk about humanities and social science, that's that, right? These three things have these advantages, but they also obviously have differences. They're very different from each other, but they also have things in common, and that's what I want to talk about next. I'm using time. Okay, I need to speed up a bit. So value, which is quantities of labour under actually just conditions of production, and sector by sector physical output, which is stuff that the math checks out, we've got the value term. The thing that they have in common is they are quantities which cycle back into production so as to yield a surplus. That doesn't happen with entropy, right? Entropy mostly just gets dissipated into the environment around the production process. Yeah? So if you fire a brick in a kiln, you're creating masses of entropy, right? But that entropy will just sit there and they dissipate from the kiln. It's not sitting in the brick in the builder's yard down the road when you sell the brick, right? So it doesn't, there's no surplus, which means there's no aspect of this that it's not capturing. So that's, but value and sector by sector do capture the surplus phenomenon. Okay, sector by sector physical output, entropy transformed, entropy arising. The thing that these have got in common is that they're physical quantities, right? Whereas value isn't a physical quantity, it's a social quantity. It describes this social process, but it doesn't. You were asking earlier about the divide, post-Stratford divide, that the other team will foreground the social element and say, well, you don't need the numbers to stack up because it describes the social process and that's all we need from it. But the thing is that energy transformed or entropy arising, etc., they're objective physical quantities, which is helpful and useful. And then the thing that value and energy transformed or entropy arising is they're system-wide. They describe the totality. Yeah. And the key contribution that Ben and I make in that paper is to say, well, there's actually something in the middle. There is a property of commodities that does all three of these things. And this is why I struggle to tell Marxists. If you tell Marxists this, they're like, no, you can't do that. That's not, you're not allowed, right? That property is called thermodynamic depth, and I'm so excited to tell you about it. all of this stuff that you did, the Richard Scarry, and that's just the preamble to me going to tell you about thermodynamic depth, which is the coolest property known to statistical mechanics. So, are you with me so far? We're looking at something that basically has in common these three phenomena that are in and of themselves inadequate descriptions of physical surplus in various ways. What we're saying is there's this way of talking about physical surplus that meets all of the needs that are met by these three things. So you can have them meet in the middle. You can compute physical surplus using Stratfordian algebra where the maths checks out, but then talk about that physical surplus as a social totality in the way that value does. And it's a physical property of commodities, so you can talk about it scientists, and they'll take you seriously. So that's why I'm so excited about this. Right. So I'm going to use the analogy of chess to explain what thermodynamic depth is. Here's a starting position of a chess game in Forsyth-Edwards notation. Now, so we know the chess position, right? That is a certain chess position. But it contains uncertainty. So, for example, we don't know which, these two white rooks, we don't know which rook is where, because we don't care, right? We don't care which rook is which of those two. We care, obviously we don't mix these two up, but we don't mind mixing these two up. So there's uncertainty here which we don't care about. And the really curious thing about that uncertainty is if the system undergoes a process, that uncertainty doesn't increase. In fact, I should have used the black rooks because one of the white rooks disappeared. So we don't know. Let's say the rook A and rook B, right? In that starting position, we didn't know which was rook A and which was rook B. Well, the same is true now, but there's no rook C. There's no increase in the uncertainty. Now, you might think, well, okay, so what? But in fact, there's a problem there because this thing's undergone a process, and processes produce entropy, and entropy is a kind of entropy and uncertainty are effectively the same thing. So where's the additional entropy in this position? And the answer to that question, I borrowed Richard Scarry. I borrowed this is a figure from a book by Penrose, which I stole. Again, sorry, if you're watching. This section from Penrose book isn't about thermodynamic depth. It explains this thing about entropy and processes quite well. Does anyone here know what phase space is? You know what phase space is?
In theory.
So you know that entropy is for those of you who don't, phase space is a way of thinking about, phase space in this context is a way of thinking about quantities of entropy as if they are volumes of a notional space. That's all you need to know. Don't know any more than that. So the uncertainty in this position, either which rook is which or whatever, that's a volume of phase space. You see a volume of phase space here. And then the process phase space, and that same volume of phase space, the same volume gets spread over a bigger area. Yeah. And you might think, well, what's in all that? What's in the rest of that area? And the answer is all the other ways in which the system could have arrived at that position. Right? So if you describe a system at the end of a process with some certainty about macroscopic features, but some uncertainty about microscopic features, the uncertainty about microscopic features is the same amount of uncertainty as you had at the beginning of the process, and all the extra entropy is accounted for to make the number add up by looking at all the different ways that the system could have got to that ending point. Which means this is the brilliant thing about thermodynamic depth. If you know how it got to that end point, and this, in fact, is the end point of Game 6 between Boris Spassky and Bobby Fischer in the 1972 World Championship in Reykjavik. If you know how it got to its endpoint, you can subtract the amount of uncertainty at the starting point from the amount of uncertainty you've got now, and what you're left with is the amount of information you've added to the system that isn't all of the information you didn't care for in the first place, like where or which room is. So I'm going to make that more, make it easy to understand. I'm going to use the example of a lump of clay here, right? Now, in a lump of clay here, you have this volume of phase space. And the reason it has a volume of phase space, not a single point, is because we don't know where all its particles are. Yeah, we don't know where they are, we don't know where they're moving, we don't know what. Okay. Doesn't matter, we don't care. You know it's a lump of clay, all we care about is a lump of clay, right? If we then shape it into an oblong with flat sides, stick it in a kiln, turn it into a brick, when we know how we did it, then what we can do is we can subtract its entropy at that point, the uncertainty attaching to it at that point, the volume of phase space it inhabits at that point, from the volume of phase space it inhabits now. And what we're left with is the amount of information that we've added to it by turning it into an oblong with flat sides and rigidity, like a brick, right? So it's a tally, thermodynamic depth is a tally of the amount of process that something has undergone in order to become what you want it to be in terms of its macroscopic features that matter to you. Now, because of that, it's because that's what it is, it has been criticized by people working in statistical mechanics for being effectively socially constructed, because we get to choose, the person doing the macroscopic observations gets to choose what matters and what doesn't matter. But the point we make in our paper is that for commodities, that isn't a good criticism, because the observer doesn't get to choose what matters about a commodity, the market does. And Mark says this on a literary page like that. He says, you know, we're not going to talk about the various branches of industrial know-how that tell you what constitutes a commodity for the purposes of market exchange. You know, that's up to them. So we've got a similar thing going on where commodities, the macroscopic properties that the determination of which macroscopic properties that we care about is not done by us. So we're not open to the accusation that this is subjective analysis by us as political economists. Okay, so the point being that we can look at the output of the production of commodities by means of commodities, and we can say we can quantify the amount of process that something's undergone. What we can do is we can look at the output and say that for any given set of conditions of production, there exists a quantity of thermodynamic depth measured in joules per Kelvin, which is the unit that you measure entropy, because we're subtracting one amount of entropy from another, you get thermodynamic depth. We're measuring in joules per Kelvin. But for any given set of conditions of production, there exists a quantity of thermodynamic depth measured in joules per Kelvin produced per work a second of average labor. Right? So a brick has this thermodynamic depth has been contrasted with a lump of clay, whatever, and you know every commodity has a thermodynamic depth as contrasted with the raw materials that went into it. So that constitutes a sort of tally of the amount that we're increasing the thermodynamic depth of commodities by doing work on them. And for any given set of conditions of production, there'll be an average quantity of thermodynamic depth produced per work a second. Right? In our paper we call it persist, which is a The neologisms are often ergon, labour, inclusive leverage. That's terrible pronunciation. I talked to a Greek guy about this, and when he pronounced it, he was like, "Oh yeah, you've got this interesting neologism, ergonopolis." I was like, "Okay." That's not how I thought it pronounced it. But anyway, it's a terrible word. No one likes it. But my co-author Ben wanted to call it something much more readily grasped, like efficiency. But I thought it's too much baggage. We need a neologism because we talk very specifically about the amount of thermodynamic depth produced per worker second of average labour, not some general productivity or efficiency. So remember the value that's B here is worker seconds of average labour. That's value in the Marxian sense. So ergo-persist is depth per depth over value, right? That's a conversion back to the two. So if you have static conditions of production, then value equals thermodynamic depth, literally as a physical quantity of commodities, physical property of commodities under capitalism that is convertible between joules per Kelvin as the thermodynamic depth and worker seconds of average labour in the Marxian sense. That's why Marxists hate this, because they know you can't do that. Value is this unique sui generis property. But where it gets scary is that so we can already say because value, you know, the thing about the vampire, dead labour feeding off the living, we already recognise that value has this impulse, this inner impulse to create more of itself, right? So that means that under capitalist mode production, thermodynamic depth has this impulse to create more of itself. But it gets worse because obviously one of the features of capitalism is the improvement of production techniques and the improvement of technology. Now, if you have the same D output, same depth of output, but you've got more efficient technology, that means that the amount of worker seconds of labour to produce that unit of output goes down. So if you're going to model this, you assume everything's the same population of workers, they do the same amount of work per day. So that means that as V goes down, E is going to go up, right? But V can't go below zero, wouldn't make any sense. So you have to assume that V kind of asymptotic to zero, or kind of tails off like that, which means that on these simple modeling assumptions, this thing, the amount of thermodynamic depth produced per worker second of average labour under capitalism, is going to go up exponentially, right? Does everyone follow the master? Good. So the advances in production technology per worker second ratio, thermodynamic depth equals itself under capitalist production will tend to increase exponentially. And that follows from the Marxist account of technological improvement in capitalism and the nature of thermodynamic depth is something which under static conditions of production is convertible between value and thermodynamic depth by reference to this constant. Okay, so we've got this system with an exponentially increasing output of this property of commodity. Why biology? Okay, I'm going to just take 2 seconds to catch my breath. But just remind you, I'm really ill, so I'm really tiring myself out. I just have a 2 seconds of rest and relax. 35 minutes as well. That's not too bad. That's right, isn't it? No, when did I start? No, okay, yeah. Okay, I'm refreshed. Thank you for your patience. Right. So this is a bit where we're talking about dissipative structures. Dissipative structure. How do you know what dissipative structure is? Yes. What's it? Guess what dissipative?
No, I don't.
Pedagogic mode. Does anyone want to have a guess?
Would it be a part of a system that produces a certain amount of energy, and with that energy dissipates?
Yeah. So I mean so broadly. So dissipative structures are a feature of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. So the starting point is to understand equilibrium thermodynamics. This is like classical thermodynamics from Carnot and those people from the kind of age of steam when they're working out how that all works. And the systems that they describe are at or near thermodynamic equilibrium. Right? And so take, for example, a body of fluid where you've got like a warmer fluid and a cooler fluid, and then eventually, and then what will happen is that the warmth will dissipate through the, and so eventually you'll end up with a homogeneous amount of heat throughout the tube, through a single body of fluid. And that's kind of really typical, simple example of classical thermodynamics doing its thing. Non-equilibrium thermodynamics is about situations where things are kept away from thermodynamic equilibrium. So you've got an energy gradient, and there's something stopping that energy gradient from just becoming, from you stop something that becoming just thermodynamic equilibrium and no energy gradient there, right? So contrasting with the example of two bodies of fluid, one from the other, situation where you're heating some fluid from below. Now, what happens when you give the system enough energy, you put it across an energy gradient steep enough, what will happen, as you said, is structures will emerge spontaneously across that energy gradient, right? And the example is convection structures, convection cells. So what was in a near equilibrium state, a matter of energy diffusing through the fluid without motion, once the energy gradient gets big enough, because you stuck a Bunsen burner under the thing, then these structures spontaneously. And lots of things are dissipative structures. But one we're interested in at the moment, this one, which is life. But I called it a dissipative structure gone rogue. And the reason I'm calling it a dissipative structure gone rogue is because if you think about convection cells, they only exist when the specific energy gradient that gives rise to them is in place, right? And if you get rid of it, they disappear. And they don't have a kind of, they don't have an adaptive mechanism that enables them to adapt to a different energy gradient type. So if you knock over a beaker full of water, where you've got a beaker full of water on a Bunsen burner, it's got convection cells in it. If you knock it over, the hot water doesn't then kind of, make its way into the socket in the wall and start using electrical power, mains power instead to maintain its structure. It just becomes a load of water on the floor, right? But life's different because it has the adaptive machinery of evolution by natural selection, which has meant that it started off in, so it is supposed, there's particular kinds of thermodynamic vents, not thermodynamic, sorry, hydrothermal vents, undersea hydrothermal vents, and it can feed off all sorts of energy gradients. Obviously, solar energy. There are those little critters that feed off pH gradients in mines. Remember them? I mean, so the adaptive machinery of evolution by natural selection has meant that it's no longer tied to the energy gradient from which it originated. Can we think collectively as a group? Can we think of any others? Are there any other dissipative structures gone rogue? Or is life the only one? Is life the only dissipative structure that has adaptive machinery?
And perhaps viruses.
Well, okay, yeah. Right. So this is So this is part of one of the core things here. It's that the system of commodities being produced by means of commodities that produces that physical surplus, that produces that exponential increase of thermodynamic depth, is the only other one. That's only the only other one that we can think of, right? So there's a kind of, so one of them. Now I'm sure that in philosophy biology circles, the conversation about like what is life, that's the boring thing in the world. Likewise, for legal scholars, what is law? But I'm using an expanded definition of life here just because I want to fit capitalism and biological life as we know it into the same definition. So I'm saying that life is dissipative structures gone rogue. If you've got a dissipative structure gone rogue, you've got a form of life. And that's why this is xenobiology, to talk about this physical dynamic of exponentially increasing thermodynamic depth. What about the relationship between these two guys, though? So I'm thinking about that as now thermodynamic depth but it was created by the authors who came up with it as a measure of complexity. So that's not how I've introduced it, because I'm doing something else with it. But they said, oh, this is a measure of complexity. So let's think about complexity and compare complexity here with complexity here. So let's talk about the complexities of the biology. So complexity among organisms. I'm getting this from Stephen Gould, but also these guys who wrote this book. Do you know these guys? Complexity among organisms is an emergent statistical property of a system where the underlying mechanisms random mutation in the context of a lower limit on complexity, rather than reflecting a positive impulse towards increasing complexity. So he's got a sort of distribution of complexity. But life can't go that way because of the lower limit of biological complexity. So you just have this, as the system unfolds, then this point here is just going to go further and further in that direction. That's how complexity arises. So if you measure it additively, using that reference to thermodynamic depth, remember thermodynamic depth is a measure of process. So if you measure it in that way, the complexity of organisms is broadly going to be a function of the cumulative number of genetic mutations reflected in phenotypes of the extent species. Probably something like that. It doesn't matter. It's not like we're not making a particularly precise claim here. The point, because however you measure it, as long as you've got any rational measure of complexity, it's thermodynamic depth, certainly one of them. It's gonna have this, complexity of organisms is going to look something like a measure of that. But the point is, it's extremely slow to increase, right? Because the next generation of organisms is not generally much more complex than the previous generation. Right? I mean, the complexity has taken billions of years to emerge. The point is, we're comparing that with the exponential increase in complexity of commodities being produced by commodities, which we said has got this structural tendency to increase exponentially. So there's a difference there. But there's more to it. Currently, the total complexity among organisms is plummeting right now because we're in the middle of a catastrophic extinction event. Right? So that's an important point that I want to take forward into my theory and speculation section, which sadly for me, well, I could arguably stop, couldn't I? Because we've about to take 45 minutes.
I think once a year in speculation.
You want the theory and speculation? So what's the relationship between these organisms? I think this is why we want to come to life. We've always we know that it's not. We know that capitalism is not an extended human phenotype phenomenon, right? That's not the extended phenotype concept. Doesn't apply to this stuff for the reasons that Dawkins explains in this piece here. But no one was thinking about capitalism as part of the extended human phenotype. No one was thinking that way. So I put that slide in just because it's just. So what is the relationship? We've already said that this one over here on the left, the capitalism is producing the biodiversity. I'll see some data on that. That's why I put that here, because nice data on biodiversity. But the other thing is not just the biodiversity loss. The other thing, because it's not that capitalism is causing, it's causing extinction event measured by biodiversity. But here's an XKCD cartoon of, which, I mean, this is based on proper data, because it's XKCD, and knows what it's doing, right? This is biomass of land mammals, right? So look at this. There's us, right? Cattle, pigs, goats, sheep, horses, and these, this is wild animals. Yeah, these little tiny green specks on the edge. So what's happening? So the point is us. Land animals that are also commodities, and really nothing else. That's the direction this thing is going in. So if you think of life as an emergent dissipative structure from the energy gradient across these hydrothermal fence, right, that went rogue because what somehow emerged was this mechanism whereby it can adapt to other energy gradients. So it's been searching for ways to dissipate energy. So that's what dissipative structures do. It's just that it's doing this in this rogue way, looking for energy gradients to dissipate across, right? And then after however many billion years, 3 and a bit billion years, there's humans. Humans, obviously, we kind of, we're quite inventive, and we've created this way for this process of additional complexity that is quite slow to go much faster. So we can now dissipate energy in ways that life hadn't really thought of. Right? So we really do that really well. Burning things. But as we know, this is a huge catastrophic eco calamity going on. So this and the suggestion is that this other form of life, production of commodities by means of commodities under capitalism, that's now the dominant dissipative structure gone rogue. So you might think of it a little bit like a eukaryotic cell. And the process that this is the lyric speculation, the process I want to call to mind is the process of symbiogenesis. And if we think of capital as a kind of like a eukaryotic cell, then that puts us here as like the mitochondria, that we're now we're familiar with the idea of symbiogenesis, right? That the mitochondria in our cells were once separate organisms, that some primordial process of either predation or parasitism meant that they then became organelles within a more complex structure. So I think the suggestion is that the new dominant dissipative structure gone rogue is now the production of quantities by means of commodities. And that's carrying us forward into the future as we who are dependent on it and the other forms of life that aren't being carried forward by this symbiogenetic composite organism are being catastrophically marginalized. Right, there you go. There's the speculation here. That's the hit.
So